Thank you very much, Professor Andrews, and it is a real pleasure to be with you once again to talk about the prospect for relations between the United States and Russia in the new administration. Am I speaking too loudly, or is there a lot of echo? Okay, as long as people can understand. This election surprised me about as much as it did almost everybody I know. And I have to be very modest about my ability to predict, because, a little over a year ago, when Donald Trump announced that he was going to run for president, one of the students in my class asked me, well, what sort of president would Mr. Trump be? And I said, don't worry about it. He's going to self-destruct in about 6 weeks. He'll never be president. So don't expect me to make any more predictions. When I was ambassador in the Soviet Union, people often would come to me and ask me, well, what's going to happen about this and what's going to happen about that? And I had a standard answer. I would say, I don't know what's going to happen. When it happens, I'll be happy to explain to you why it was inevitable. And of course, what we're seeing now is our various pundits and political scientists trying to figure out whether and if and how the election results were inevitable. So what I'm going to be talking about today is not a prediction of what the policy will be, but an explanation of what they might be, what I would advise President-elect Trump to do in regard to Russia. And in thinking about this, I try to think back about the time early on in the Reagan administration, when I was called to Washington and given the task of developing a negotiating strategy with the Soviet Union. We had a little experience there, and we went from almost the height of the Cold War to ending it within 3 to 4 years. Now, the situation now is quite a different one in many respects. Relations between the United States and Russia look very bad, and as a matter of fact, the rhetoric is just about at the level it was at the height of the Cold War. When you look beyond that rhetoric, you find that actually the issues are not nearly as serious for the most part as they were then. On the other hand, some aspects now, and particularly I would say the image of the United States within Russia is worse today than it was at the height of the Cold War. Because with all of the communist propaganda during the Cold War, the Russian people basically had a relatively friendly and admiring attitude toward Americans. That has changed. And it's most deplorable that it has. And it has changed in part because of intensive propaganda by the regime, but also because of the Russian interpretation of some of the things that we have done since the end of the Cold War. Now, it seems to me that Vladimir Putin's, many of his actions have been very damaging to Russia and detrimental to Russia's interests. But at the same time, they have remained relatively popular. Not that he has no opposition, of course he does, but still he maintains probably more popularity in Russia on grounds that he is defending Russian national interests than, say, President Obama has maintained here. Although I think we should remember that President Obama has been more popular than either of the candidates who ran to succeed him. But when we think about how that came about, what caused the decisions that the Russian leadership has made, I think that it's very clear that in many cases, the Russian leaders have been responding in most unfortunate ways to what has happened here, what has happened in American policy. I'll mention some of those later, but basically, from 1991, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union broke up and the independent Russian Federation was created, to today, we have gone from a period when about 80% of the Russians admired the United States, and now close to 80% consider the United States an enemy. This is a very dangerous situation because along with that, we have seen arising a problem that we thought we had under control. And this is the most important problem at all, and that is the problem of nuclear weapons. Now, it does seem to me that in thinking about our relations with Russia and thinking about our international relations in general, we need to think about, well, what are the most vital issues? We often hear people say, well, U.S. and Russian interests are not identical, we're in conflict, and that we each have sort of an obligation to defend our national interests. It seems to me that the most important national interest of each of us and of every other country in the world is to avoid a nuclear conflict. That is the only issue which is totally vital to both of us. And it is something that in this last presidential campaign was virtually forgotten. Meanwhile, the genie that we thought we had put in a pretty tight bottle by 1991 is beginning to grow again. We have recently, there have ended, as a result of decisions on both sides, virtually all nuclear cooperation with Russia. Now, it just happens that Russia is the only country with the capability, if they use these nuclear weapons, or even part of them, of essentially wiping us out. Now, of course, if they did so, they would also suffer the same fate. Now, as a matter of fact, a nuclear exchange, even with the reduced weapons we have now, if it got out of hand, could virtually destroy civilization on Earth. I'm firmly convinced, through several decades of working with these issues, that the very existence of nuclear weapons in the quantities we have them is a threat to humanity. And if Russia and the United States do not control that, there is really catastrophe ahead. And we're not controlling it. Now, so the first advice I would give President Trump is to think about trying to renew with President Putin the understanding that President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev made in their first meeting in Geneva in 1985. And that was a nuclear war must not be won, a nuclear war cannot be won, must not be fought, and that means there can be no war between us. Now, if you believe that, and it seems to me it's almost a truism, then it makes no sense whatsoever to confront each other militarily. No sense. Because when you begin to get in the sort of military confrontation which is developing between Russia and NATO over issues that may not even exist, after all, Russia has not threatened the territorial integrity of any NATO member, and yet NATO has decided to put more and more forces in Eastern Europe, which, of course, is going to mean that Russia will not only bolster its forces along there, but begin to bring nuclear weapons into other areas, such as Kaliningrad Oblast. It does seem to me that this issue of dealing with nuclear weapons trumps every other issue in the relationship. I mean that literally, and I hope that somehow the pun is also going to be applicable. Now, for that reason, I would say, first of all, I think that President Obama, in his initial meeting with President-elect Trump, struck exactly the right tone in recommending that we do all we can to help him make the right decisions that will bring us together again. And I think that's exactly what we should be trying to do. But later, when he started traveling to Europe, he also recommended that President Trump continue the confrontation with Russia regarding Crimea and Ukraine. I think that is absolutely wrong. And I must say, I was personally a strong Obama supporter. I deplore the way the Republican leadership refused to cooperate with things he did. But having said all that, I think his record in dealing with Russia is far less than perfect, and that one has to find a different approach for going about this. Now, aside from this nuclear issue, is it true that U.S. and Russian interests are that much in conflict? You often hear that, but when I begin to look at the issues, it seems to me that basically Russian interests and American interests are quite consistent. Aside from the nuclear issue, which, as I said, I think is by far the most important one, since it deals with the potential of our very existence. What are the others? Global warming? Absolutely, in the long run. Well, either we cooperate with that, or we're all going to be in a jam. Terrorism. They're even more vulnerable than we are. And we have precisely the same enemies in jihadist Islam. And they are more vulnerable, and they are much closer geographically to the places where this comes from. Many more of the people from Russia and from other erstwhile parts of the Soviet Union are involved in this and could come home. Another issue where our interests are practically identical. And then when we think about the broader issues we have in the future of dealing with failed states, of dealing with the whole health issues, other environmental issues, it's clear that these big issues that affect us all are going to require cooperation. And not just cooperation with Russia, but also very certainly cooperation with China, cooperation with India, cooperation with other big countries. To compete over who controls or influences this spot of territory or another is almost irrelevant to these big issues. But they are precisely the sort of competition that brought the world the First World War, and even more tragically, the Second World War. Let's face it, as important it is to Russia and Ukraine, Ukrainian independence in precisely the form it had is of almost no direct national security interest to the United States. Of course, we have a humanitarian interest in everywhere, in people being able to live as well as they can, and people being able to choose their governments. But to say that somehow what the border is between Russia and Ukraine is a vital American security interest is based on reasoning which I simply can't understand. And yet, this is what we often hear. Of course, we also basically say, well, Russia violated international law when it annexed the Crimea, and has also violated promises in international law in supporting an insurrection in the Donbass. Well, that's true. Are we the enforcers? Since 1991, who has violated international law? The United States did first when it bombed Serbia over Kosovo without UN approval, because Serbia had not attacked the United States or any of its allies. It violated in 2008 its agreement under the Helsinki Final Act that any change of borders should be by mutual agreement when we recognize the independence of Kosovo, even though it was not independent, really, and Serbia had not agreed to the change of borders. You know, there were those of us at the time who recognized that we're setting precedents that can come back and haunt us. And then if you want to talk about aggression and the violation of international law, nothing Russia has done approaches the seriousness of the American invasion of Iraq. We were told not only by Russia, but also by our allies, friends, Germany and France, don't do it. We had no UN authority to do it. Even if Saddam Hussein had retained a few nuclear weapons, the invasion, as we claimed at the time, the invasion would have been illegal under UN rules if we didn't have a Security Council decision, and we didn't. Not only because Russia and China didn't vote for it, but also we didn't even have a majority of the non-permanent members of the Security Council. So when we start accusing Russia of violating international law, we're in a pretty poor position. And the Russians could say, hey, you do whatever you wish and define it as necessary. When we do something we consider necessary, suddenly we're wrong. And they would argue, look, in the case of Crimea, the Crimeans had never, the people on Crimea had never been given a chance to vote whether they wanted to be in Ukraine or in Russia. The majority of the people were Russian-speaking. And, well, they conducted a referendum. That's, of course, questionable and legally in the sense because Russia had occupied it. But let's face it, they did it peacefully. When we did much the same in regard to Kosovo, we killed a lot of people and destroyed a lot of territory and a lot of facilities in Serbia. So I'm just saying that to a Russian, And even to some of the rest of us, we have not been in the best position to be sort of the world's enforcer of international law, because our attitude has seemed to others, international law is what we say it is. We can do whatever we wish. And others simply have to accept it and lump it because, you know, our intentions are good. And I think that this is a problem. And I think that now, looking back as to how we cool things during the Cold War, one of the first things we did was to try to define a strategy which would get us off this zero-sum mentality. The idea that anything one side did to favor it would be a negative to the other side to the same degree. That was part of it. And of course, the second was to develop something like, you would need something like a personal trust between the leaders. The psychology of the leaders' interaction is extremely important. So one of the first things we did was to begin to define goals that were actually in the interests of a peaceful Soviet Union. We also decided that there were two things that were not going to be in our agenda. One, we would not question the legitimacy of the Soviet government, that is, know what we later call regime change. And the second was we were not going to seek military superiority. When I got agreement on that, and Reagan agreed to it, we put it out as a directive to all agencies to make it clear that despite our distaste for communism, our problem was their activity abroad in forcing it on others. It was not our duty to try to remove it inside. I mean, Reagan's view was this is a crazy system and a bad system, but if that's what they want, that's their business. Our problem is when they force it on other people. Then the second thing is, how do you build trust between the individuals? And one of the things that President Reagan paid most attention to, actually, he would tend to get a little impatient with a lot of details of arms control and things like that, but he never got bored when we began to talk about Mikhail Gorbachev, where he was coming from, the constraints on the Soviet leader. In other words, what he was thinking about, how can you make contact with this person? Then maybe because he was an actor, he was pretty good about putting himself in the shoes of the other guy. People used to say, oh, Reagan, he was only an actor. Well, one of the great problems I've had with many American politicians and presidents often is they have great trouble understanding people who come from a different culture. There tends to be a presumption that our way of thinking is the right way, and if anybody else doesn't think that way, there's something wrong with them, and they're probably even hostile. But you really, if you're going to deal effectively with a foreign leader, particularly one from a rather radically different society, you better understand the mode of thinking and so on. And that's something that it took a little time, and I can't say they understood each other in their first meeting. You know, they got along in a businesslike way. But you know, by the time Reagan left office, he and Gorbachev had bonded. And to the point that to this day, if anybody runs down Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev's present, he'll tell him you're wrong. This was a man of great political judgment who loved peace. And now let's compare this with relations between President Obama and President Putin. You know, it's just hard for me to understand what President Obama thinks he has to gain from constantly putting Putin down. Now, this in no way is a defense of what Putin has done. In fact, it seems to me often when those of us explain why we did things that have encouraged him to have certain reactions, people would say, oh, you're just a Putin apologist. No, I'm not one who is going to apologize or justify or anything else what he has done. I think much has been very damaging to Russia. I think much has not been in Russia's interest, and I think a lot of things would be self-correcting in the long run if we would simply stay out of it. But instead, you have actually a public and very personal debate. I was appalled that President Obama, in his State of the Union address, actually bragged that our sanctions were costing Vladimir Putin a lot because of his policies in Ukraine. They weren't costing Putin anything. The financial ones, he and his cronies can certainly take care of themselves. They're costing the Russian people. And they're convincing the Russian people that their problems come from the United States and not from Putin's own policy. So one of the things, it's not just that. How many times have you heard the president explain, well, Russia is only a regional power? What in the world is that supposed to mean? We have more power, therefore you don't count? Or, since most of the issues we're talking about are in a region much closer to Russia than to us, that they're not even a regional power. Is this true? Russia is the only country in the world with enough nuclear weapons and ICBMs to destroy us totally. Is that regional? They probably have cyber warfare capabilities at least on a level with us. If we send people up to the International Space Station, we have to use Russian lifters. That's regional? Come on. They're not as powerful as we are militarily. They don't have as large economy. Does that mean they have no interests whatsoever? Now, look, I don't want to just beat on the president too much, but frankly, one has to wonder about the advice he's getting. And I was really appalled, maybe this was an explanation, when he told the editor of the New Yorker in an interview about 2 years ago, oh, I don't need a George Kennan. Well, he does. But what I think really sent them up the wall most was the constant reference on various things that we are an exceptional people. Well, I'm sure he thinks when he's using that, he's telling us that we're exceptional because we are willing to do things in the world for other people and not just for egotistical reasons. But it comes across to others as if the rules don't apply to us. They only apply to you, and we define the rules. Now, of course, in a literal sense, every country is exceptional, in the sense there's no such thing as an average country or something that would fit everyone. We're all, just as we're individually unique, so are our countries. So I think understanding that some of these attitudes and so on are counterproductive is important for recognizing some of the reasons we got into the situation that we're in. But let's go a little further in thinking about the general attitude, because in a more general sense, aside from these particulars, what has happened since 1991 has been, we have moved from the assumption on both sides that we were not only at peace, but in the most basic matters of national security in both countries, that we were friends and were cooperating. And yet the reaction here and some of our actions have created an entirely false narrative of what has happened since the Soviet Union broke up. We have one, they have one. Neither are accurate, and yet it has brought us to some of the problems we have. If there are any of my students here, they've heard this several times before, but I do want to emphasize it. What was one of the bases of these differences? First of all, it was the claim, we won the Cold War. Well, when you say that, it sounds like we won and they were defeated. Who was they? Well, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, not the Russian Federation of today. Another mistake people often make, treat the Russian Federation as if it's just an extension of the Soviet Union. I don't have time to describe all those differences, but did we win the Cold War in that sense? No. We won it in the sense that everybody won it. When it didn't go hot, we were all winners. But we won it by negotiating with the Soviet Union and reaching agreements, every one of which was in the interest of the Soviet Union. We didn't defeat them. We found a common interest in meeting a common goal. They were hurting more from the arms race than we were, and to get their economy. And actually, this hostility was something that bolstered the authoritarian and even totalitarian ability of the Soviet leadership. They could always look at that foreign enemy. So by ending the Cold War, we liberated the Soviet Union and its leadership to try to reform its own system. And that's what Gorbachev was trying to do. And now the second of these things is to consider the breakup of the Soviet Union as if it was the end of the Cold War. The Cold War had been over at least 2 years before the Soviet Union broke up. It broke up despite the end of the Cold War and not because it. And a lot of people even have the feeling that the breakup of the Soviet Union was an American objective in the Cold War. It was not. Of course, we wanted the 3 Baltic countries to regain their independence. We never recognized they were part of the Soviet Union. But we would have preferred that the others stay together in a reforming and increasingly democratic federation that Gorbachev was trying to form. And President Bush the Elder made that clear August 1st, 1991 in a speech in Kiev. So, and then after all of that, you have the idea, now we're the sole superpower. There were two superpowers before, now we're the only one. And since we brought down communism, since we brought down the Soviet Union, well, we can go anywhere we need to and create a democratic government. Well, I'll tell you something. If ability to destroy another country is an attribute of superpower, Russia is still a superpower, and let's not forget it. And second is, what does superpower mean? Does it mean you can destroy another country? Does it mean you can go to another country and create a government? Does it mean that you can go out and create democratic governments throughout the world? That seemed to be one of the assumptions. And yet, what is democracy? Well, Abraham Lincoln had defined it as government of the people, by the people, for the people. How can any outsider establish any one of those three requirements? It's a total oxymoron. And, increasingly, as our desire to promote democracy began to develop, other countries began to look at it the same way we looked at communist parties during the Cold War. An attempt to overthrow governments and replace them with puppet governments that we control. In other words, regime change. Well, that's what we tried in Iraq. That's what we tried in Libya. That's what we encouraged in Egypt. Well, it's what we started out, and for most of the Obama administration insisted on in Syria. Assad must go. Well, it hasn't had the effects that it's supposed to. So putting all those things together, and also the fact that personal relations, as I said, do matter, that you're really not going to get very far with a foreign leader unless you deal with them with a degree of respect, and if you have differences, keep it private. Now, it doesn't mean you can't debate issues, but you don't insult personal character. You don't call into question whether another country has national interests that they have the right to express and defend. If we take all those things into account, how is it possible that a President Trump might bring us into a better relationship with Russia? I think it is possible, but of course everything depends on the sort of choices he makes. During the campaign and in his life, he has made so many different statements in so many different ways. I don't think anybody can predict, maybe he can't himself, exactly where he's going to come down on some of these issues. But let me say, first of all, that I think he has already met one of their requirements. He has shown respect for Vladimir Putin. And what he said, he said a lot of things I don't agree with, but most of what he said, if you take him literally, there's nothing to disagree with. He said, isn't it better to get along with Russia than to oppose them? Well, if you think about nuclear weapons, that's certainly true. And then he also said he thought Putin wasn't a very effective politician. Well, if he can do all the things he has done, many of which are not in Russia's interest, and still say relatively popular in the country, he is a very capable politician. I don't think he's necessarily approved the things he's done, particularly internally, But of course, one of the points that Putin and many Russians would make, look, their government is their business. Our government is our business. And as we have been promoting democracy abroad, has anybody noticed that it hasn't been doing too well here? Last election has shown how deeply we're divided. Neither of our political parties now has a majority of registered voters. I think there are more independents than either Democrats or Republicans. And we still have no prospect yet of national unity on a lot of important things. Many people feel virtually disenfranchised. So it was interesting that while we are supposedly promoting democracy abroad, we're not paying much attention to it here. And the thing there is that there's probably only one way to promote democracy, and that is to show how it works here. Not by going out like missionaries to evangelize the world and coming across as opposing the existing governments. So what specifically can a President Trump do with what starts out as, you might say, an acceptable personal relationship with Vladimir Putin? The first thing I would advise is, after advanced preparation, obviously you've got to have emissaries go and make sure this is going to work, is for him to meet with Putin and to reiterate in some form that same formula that Reagan and Gorbachev enunciated in their first meeting. A nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and that means there can be no war between us. And then, inasmuch as there are tensions, there should be proposed, with preparation, again, so you know what's going to happen, a meeting between NATO and the Russian military to decide upon withdrawing from the borders major military forces and uniform rules on how you're going to conduct surveillance. We hear a lot about Russian planes flying too close to NATO planes and ships and possible incidents. Most of these planes and ships, by the way, are surveying, are surveillance. You know, we had very extensive surveillance along the Soviet and Chinese borders all during the Cold War. Having these assets meant that even though the Cold War ended, we kept it up. And it's very irritating. It's irritating to China, it's irritating to Russia. And I think that these flights, they're giving us a bit of our own medicine. We've really got to sit down and say, okay, what irritates you, what irritates us, let's get rid of it. This is nonsense. I do think that should be possible. How about Syria and the Middle East? If ever our basic interest is that similar to Russians, indeed almost identical, it has to be Syria. What's the threat there? The threat to both of us is ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you want to call it. It's not Assad. Oh yeah, he's done terrible things to his own people. But what is there to replace him and hold the country together? And suppose you don't, who gets most of the brunt of the breakdown? Russia does, much more than we. And the idea that they have no role there, that they have no interest there, this just boggles the mind. Of course they do. And so I think one of the problems there is that, according to WikiLeaks, from about, was it 2006, 2007, Well, late in the second Bush administration, we began clandestine efforts to remove Assad. Instead of keeping a representation there, I remember Rebecca and I visited Damascus in 2009. This was almost a year into the Obama administration. We still hadn't sent an ambassador. Well, if we had really wanted to influence the situation, we should have full diplomatic representation and should do what influence we had to try to keep the internal situation from boiling over into conflict. Instead, we seem to have supported some factions, and these factions, the so-called moderates, were heavily infiltrated with Al-Qaeda types, which the Russians began to tell us from the very beginning. So, this is one, I think, it's a terrible situation, but I think it's one we should be able to work out if we try. Crimea, I think what we should be advising the Russians are, look, we understand all of the emotion here and so on. We also understand that in many ways politically, Ukraine is better off without Crimea. Without the votes from Crimea, the corrupt president they threw out would never have been elected. And the Ukrainians had repeatedly refused to give real autonomy to the largely Russian-speaking peninsula. They were never given the chance to vote whether they wanted to be in Russia or Ukraine. But what Russia did was illegal, and we shouldn't recognize it as legal. And by the way, that's a pretty heavy sanction in and of itself, because it means that a lot of economic projects probably won't go forward if the legality is not there. So how can you solve this and also save face? It would seem that what I would advise is to advising President Putin that if he will offer, as a genuine offer, a second referendum, say 2 years, 3 years, that we would advise the Ukrainians to accept that, the referendum, which would be under OSCE neutral things, and then accept that if the majority of the people really want to be in Russia, Ukraine would concede that. They could gain an awful lot, I think, politically, and would be much easier also to deal with the other issues. Now, Donbass is an entirely different issue. But I think that what strikes me there is that the current situation is one which, in the long run, is going to bleed Russia. I mean, imagine having an irredentist territory and one in which actual fighting is going on right on your border. Who's getting killed there? Russians. And if Russia's interest is protecting Russians, they have got an interest in again, making that peaceful. What has made it difficult to come to terms has been the perception that the United States and the EU want to detach all of Ukraine from Russian influence. Now, that's unacceptable, and that would be unacceptable to any Russian government. So here, too, we've got to find a way to encourage both sides to come to terms in a peaceful way and recognize that the sort of sanctions we've been putting on are not going to achieve it. And to those who say, oh, well, you're letting him get by with what he's doing in Ukraine. Well, first of all, we never owned Ukraine. It's not ours to give or to take. And as I may have mentioned before, for several centuries of history, it had no relevance to American national security whether Ukraine was in Russia or somewhere else. 50 years from now, probably nobody except the people there will notice whether it's in Russia or Ukraine. And So this, I think we have to put in perspective. On the economy, I really think that there was a mistake before in negotiating with Ukraine separate from Russia. Fact of the matter is, and let's be realists, Ukraine will never be able to be prosperous, or maybe even a united country, if it doesn't have friendly relations with Russia. And the whole idea, which really originated in the Western Ukraine, the part that was taken in by Stalin, courtesy Adolf Hitler, that Ukraine should be part of the West, and that it should be non-Russian, even though 44% of the people in the former Ukraine preferred Russian, whether they were Ukrainian or not, as their first language. You know, there was no way the Ukrainian state is going to be able to prosper or even be a normal country if it doesn't give equal rights to its Russian language citizens, if it doesn't create a sense of Ukrainian national identity, which is separate from simply being non-Russian. And this is not something we can do for them. They have to do it for themselves. And the more we get involved and convey to Russia and the Russian leaders that we're trying somehow to rip Ukraine away from their influence, it means, you know, they'll stand up. We'll make sure that doesn't happen. So actually our involvement in so-called support and in support of some elements in Ukraine, I think have done much to intensify the problem. Much of it could be resolved by the parties if we leave them alone and we advise them and support those who want to do it peacefully. I recall that when I was ambassador in the Soviet Union, representatives of the 3 Baltic countries would come to me and ask for my advice. They would say what they were planning to do to reassert their independence. And when they would get there, said, now, when we declare our independence, of course you will recognize it. I said, no, we can't do that, and don't assume we will. 2 reasons. One of them, you will not be in full control of the country, and our recognition doctrine is the governments we recognize must be in control. But the second and much more important reason is if we were to recognize your independence before you are, you'll be crushed. And there's not a thing we can do to protect you. They did it peacefully. There are a lot more details there, but the basic point is, too many of our people were telling the Ukrainians, and before that, the Georgians, well, you know, go about what you're doing, we'll protect you, eventually you'll get in NATO. No, I think it's not going to happen, and I think that was misguided advice. And finally, President Trump would have credibly to convince Putin there's going to be no further eastward expansion of NATO. You know, when you think through these things, there's not a single one of these things that should be of great cost to the United States. It can certainly enhance our prospects of national security. So what I'm saying is improvement of relations with Russia, I think, is possible. And that President Trump can, if he chooses, improve the relations to our mutual benefit. Whether he will, we shall see. Посмотрим, увидим. Thanks very much. I think there are any questions I would ask somebody to come in. My hearing is so poor, I'm not going to be able to hear you if you ask. Whatever, yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to turn it. It's over here. The fellow who did it set it up.
So, actually, since I'm standing up here, I'll
pardon.
Do you think that Obama should pardon Ed Snowden? Give amnesty Obama before he leaves office. What do you think of that?
An amnesty to...
Snowden.
Oh, no. No, I do not consider him a whistleblower.
He did great damage to national security.
He's a traitor.
Russia has withdrawn from the International Criminal Court, and she's talking about Assad and
Well, you know, we're not members of the International Criminal Court ourselves. As you probably know, President Clinton signed, but then said he wasn't going to put it up for ratification, and then Second President Bush took our signature off. The problem there is that you're not able to really charge these people while they're still in power. And if you really want them to retire and get out of the way, they're not going to do that. And one of the problems, all with trying to get rid of Assad, is that for him and for the Allied forces he controls, this is not like death. They give up control, they get wiped down. And, I don't think there's much prospect now. So suppose Assad should resign and, go off to Iran or somewhere. Are you going to bring him before the criminal court? What's that going to achieve? So, I don't know. Russia has pulled out, but we were never in. And I think after the fact, it was perhaps somewhat useful in Yugoslavia. They kept Milosevic there so long that he died before he got a verdict. But I think, again, unless the United States is willing to participate in these, and even if we do, there is a real problem with leaders who actually, are, you start charging them, as they did the president of Sudan, then how are you going to get rid of them? It's a real problem, and I just wonder how much this works. Now, with smaller countries, failed countries, it was useful to have these courts, for the Liberia, the Sierra Leone, some of those where you had, criminals in effect exploiting their people, and you're able to send forces in and arrest them. But I think that we have to face the fact that there are a lot of countries that are held together by pretty strong methods. And if we really want to encourage change that's going to work, we must encourage the use only of peaceful methods. And when people start a rebellion, and particularly if they start shooting, there are going to be no winners. You mean about criminal? I think this is something that really has to be worked out between Ukraine and Russia. Both of them are struggling with a very difficult Soviet heritage. Let's face it, the security services were all the same service, the military forces were the same, and there is deep corruption in both countries, close ties, and I don't think I'm in a position, to advise us how to work this out. I do think that, given the history and the neighbors, it will never be solved until they work it out, and that they have to do it. Whether it's Ukraine or Belarus in particular, but also some of the other non-Baltic Soviet republics, when we can check ourselves, we are in many ways getting in the middle of a family fight. And I know those of you who studied Russian literature remember Alexander Pushkin's reaction to one of the Polish revolts. He was probably one of the most Western-oriented Russian writers. But when it came to the Polish revolt and the reaction of the West criticizing Russia, he wrote a very powerful poem, Idit Kamasi, to slanderers of Russia. And the concluding lines was, you Westerners keep out of our family fights. The Bolshevik Revolution, Alexander Matlock, again, almost Western aid, but it is the poem of the Red Guard, the 12 Red Guards, almost as if they were the apostles of Christ. And then he had one, we Scythians. Again, you Europeans, you don't understand this. Now, this is a very strong strand. And that's why I say, when we get involved, and particularly in ways that seems to be against one side or the other, we're making it more difficult for them to settle it. And I don't think we are in a position to say what should be. I've given some ideas of what I thought, if it could come about, would save face on both sides, and in fact be in the interest of both sides. I mean, I don't think that a Crimea deprived of autonomy and with an important Russian naval base in Sevastopol is ever going to be a completely calm and useful part of Ukraine. And I think if that could be regularized in a way, it would be to the benefit of both. But as it is now, oh, you stole my land, no, I didn't, etc.
Matlock, you have given us a very concise picture of Europe and the relationship of Reagan and Gorbachev then. I wonder, in terms of the coming administration, who would you see, or what kinds of personalities, or who specifically would you say as a capable Secretary of State for the United States today?
Ooh, he's Secretary of State.
Well, when I thought that Secretary Clinton was going to win, I thought that the chairman of Carnegie, who spoke here earlier this year, he would be the Secretary of State. He had been Undersecretary at the time he was. I have no idea in the world whom Trump might appoint. I've heard that Romney might be a candidate. Now,
when he was campaigning, Romney described Russia as our greatest geopolitical adversary. I never understood that. Where are we supposed to be competing with them geopolitically? In Ukraine? That doesn't make sense. But he's not crazy. We have to see. And I don't think that just because the person named is somebody who has something to like or dislike, that determines what they're going to do. We'll just have to wait and see.
If I understood you correctly, I think you said Putin is relatively popular in Russia. When I talk to Russian people, he seems to be anything but popular. So I was wondering if you could, beat up on that a little bit and refer to maybe a specific section of society that Putin is popular amongst. So
He says that the Russians he speaks to do not like Putin. So you said that Putin was popular in country. Who is he popular with?
He is popular with a lot of people outside Moscow and St. Petersburg. Very widely popular. Not necessarily with the intellectuals, but with voters. I don't think there's much doubt that even if the elections were fair, he couldn't squeak by with at least a slight majority. Yes, there are a lot of people who don't like him. But I think that when you go outside Moscow and Petersburg, you find large numbers who feel that he brought them back from chaos, he gave them a certain stability. The 90s were really terrible for most people, except the few who ended up as oligarchs. And they see him, if the Russians can be very nationalistic. They see him as one who has brought Russia back to a certain dignity and standing in the world. And that's important to them. So I think that one has to bear that in mind.